Welcome, everybody. It's been 401 days since October 7th, 2023, and Israel's war against Hamas is ongoing. Nearly 100 hostages are still being held in Gaza, many deceased, but many more, we hope, still alive. We're praying for their safe return home. In the north, Hezbollah may be down, but certainly not out. They are still launching hundreds of rockets, missiles, and drones, and are still killing Israelis. The Houthis, also not down, or down, but not out, are still capable of launching attacks and hitting Jerusalem. And of course, we're still awaiting Iran's response. To cap all of this off, the US has elected Donald Trump as its 47th president. His administration is starting to take shape, but there are still many questions to be asked and answered about how his administration will address the wars in Ukraine and Israel and confront our mutual adversaries, Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea. To help us wade through much of this, I'm happy to introduce Ilan Berman. Ilan is Senior Vice President of the American Foreign Policy Council in Washington, D.C. He is an expert in regional security in the Middle East, Central Asia, and the Russian Federation. He has consulted for the CIA, U.S. Departments of State and Defense, and a range of governmental agencies and congressional offices. CNN called him one of America's leading experts on the Middle East and Iran. He's the author of 6 books, the editor of 6 others, and is a frequent commentator, having written for almost every major publication. And a little tidbit about Iran. I know this personally for having spent time with him. He is a connoisseur of Georgian wine and food. And no, that's not Georgia, the state. That is Georgia, the country. So for anybody who's in D.C., hit him up. He'll take you to his favorite Georgia restaurant. Welcome, Ilan.
Great to be here.
All right. I'm going to throw you a curveball at the outset of this conversation, given the reports over the weekend that Qatar has agreed to boot out Hamas. Do you have any thoughts, any insight that might be helpful in us understanding in this, and perhaps any prognostications about where you think leadership is going to land if indeed they are booted out?
On the latter question, I don't know. I'm sort of waiting to see, but I'm sort of struck by, I mean, and this may be sort of part and parcel of how our politics are these days, but it's sort of very absolutist. The Qataris, the move by the Qataris is being styled as a reaction to the election of Donald Trump and the anticipation of more stringent, more vengeful, shall we say, foreign policy in the near future. I think that's certainly true, but I also think that's not the full story. I was actually in Qatar in May. I travel a lot, as you know, Mark. So I spent a lot of time. I was in Qatar in May, and in Israel in June, July, and in China in August, and what have you. But when I was in Qatar, I had a really interesting conversation with some pretty well-placed Qatari officials who they're perennially bemoaning that their country gets a bad rap. And I was in the sort of unenviable position of trying to tell them, well, you're doing some pretty bad stuff. And so, the reason Americans don't trust you is because, the sort of the tango with the Taliban, the tango with Hamas and all that stuff. And they said, we take your criticism, but, we don't own this issue because a couple of months ago, so again, right, this was May. So in the spring, we actually offered to the Biden administration to kick out Hamas. And the response from the White House was, don't do it. Don't do it because we need an address for the ceasefire talks. We need officials that aren't stuck in a tunnel, that have communications that are we can access in the service of pushing forward a deal. So I fault the Qataris for a lot. And I think this move is long overdue. But I think they would have done it sooner had they gotten different signals from Washington.
Just goes to show you, per our conversation before we open this up, you can't get all your information from Twitter. So while you get some of the story, you often don't get the most important components of the story or the full picture. So that's helpful. Thank you. Sure. All right, I promise we're going to get to Russia because I think Russia is a really interesting conversation, but Iran just won't go away. In keeping with the great American lyricist Mike Tyson, everyone has a plan until they get punched in the face. Iran and Khamenei seem to be near perfect in their strategic plans for the last decade. But once they got punched in the face, and seemingly repeatedly, they have made what seems to be really bad strategic decisions after another. So we have to start with Iran and get through some of this. Let's go back to October 31st. Axios reported that Iran's attack, which was supposed to be in response to Israel's response, is expected to be carried out from Iraq using a large number of drones and ballistic missiles. There were high expectations that Iran was going to launch a massive attack. After weeks of bluster, we anticipated that it might have happened during our call last Monday. Well, that was on the 4th. Today's the 11th. It seems like it's a really bad strategic decision on Iran's part to bluster big time about an attack that doesn't happen. And now perhaps it could be really bad even if it does happen. So what is going on with Iran's strategic planning here?
Right. Well, so to zoom out a little bit, I think we have to understand where the Iranians are. And the reversal of fortune in strategic terms that the Iranians have experienced over the last couple of months has really been astronomical. If you even over the summer, right, even as recently as this summer, if you were Iranian, if you were sitting in Tehran and you were looking out at what has transpired over the preceding year, you would be sitting pretty. You would be fairly comfortable with what you've gained. You've managed to, through the actions of your proxies, proxies like Hamas, you've managed to dent the aura of invincibility, the mystique of invincibility around Israel. The Israeli war in the Gaza Strip has helped, and obviously you've sort of contributed, has helped to sideline Israel on the world stage. You have ground to a halt, at least temporarily, the Abraham Accords, which had begun to marginalize you really dramatically in the region. And so there was a lot for the Iranians to be pleased about. And you could sort of see this from the way that the Iranians were talking. They were talking more and more about Iran as a global power. There was a speech at Tehran University back in April by the head of the IRGC Navy. And that admiral actually made a claim, unironically made a claim, that the Islamic Republic should plant a flag on the South Pole. Why they would want to do that? Listen, I don't know. But a testament to the fact that they were expanding their strategic horizons, right? And then you fast forward to where you are today, and the glass is decidedly half empty, right? Part of it has to do with the fact that they've uncorked a great number of things, right? Because the reaction to Iran and its proxies running rampant in the region is that the US military is now back in the Middle East in the largest troop strength and contingent since the Second Gulf War, right? And we're not going anywhere. So that's a problem. The other problem is the Abraham Accords are not dead on arrival, right? They're just frozen. And the Saudis, who are the big prize strategically for the Israelis, have basically laid out what it would take to get the process unstuck, unfrozen. But most importantly, I think, in strategic terms, what the Israelis have managed to do in this 1-2 punch between the beginning of October and the end of October is to significantly erode Iran's principal terrorist proxy, the campaign, right? And it's sort of multi-pronged, where it starts with pagers, which the Israelis have now admitted was they're doing, goes to walkie-talkies, goes to the elimination of missile sites, goes to the decapitation and killing of the top echelon of Hezbollah's leadership, has really, if not completely eliminated, has really degraded the threat. And it was a pretty significant threat that Hezbollah posed to Israel's north. And also the larger blackmail threat, because Hezbollah was always seen as a blackmail tool against Israel, to shape Israel's behavior against Iran itself. And then you take what the Israelis did on October 26th, which, again, right, more limited than a lot of people, including myself, thought they would do, right? Because there were effectively 4 targets, right? There was military sites, which is what they hit. There were also leadership sites, which they didn't hit. There were also energy infrastructure sites, which they chose not to hit. And there was the nuclear program, which they also chose not to hit. Nonetheless, what the Israelis did, even on that sort of that one leg of the stool, is enormously consequential, because they eliminated Iran's air defense architecture almost entirely. And that means that all those other targets, the nuclear, the leadership, and the oil, are now defenseless. And they've also, at least temporarily, halted Iran's production of ballistic missiles, which forces hard choices on the Iranian leadership. If Iran is going to retaliate against Israel, and there are limits to what the proxies can do, proxies like Hamas, Hezbollah, and the Houthi rebels in Yemen, Shiite militias in Iraq, if Iran decides to retaliate directly, that's a finite number of missiles that it has, because it can't produce, as of right now, it can't produce anymore. So it forces hard choices on the Iranian leadership. So I think the Iranians right now are in a very different place than they were just a few weeks ago. But like you said, right, you led with Mike Tyson. So here's another, I don't think this is a Tysonism, but nonetheless, very important. In politics, like in sports, the adversary also gets a vote. So I think what's crucially important is what the Iranians do now. What they do now vis-a-vis their own internal population, what they do now in terms of military capabilities, and what they do now in terms of the nuclear program, because they understand that they are now in a vulnerable position.
So we're going to get there, because I want to address all three things that you just mentioned. But they have put themselves out there with a stunning threat. What is your decision tree to arrive at some prediction? Or can you make a prediction about what you think they're going to do next? Do they decide to enforce that threat and take action, or do they not?
So it's funny. So Mark, you and I have sort of offline, we've known each other for a long time. So we have these conversations over cigars and whiskey and whatever. But I'm a huge pop culture guy. So I tend to also, because I desperately try to relate to my kids. So it forces me to be a pop culture guy. But I think about it in those terms because it's actually very relatable and it's very understandable. So the answer to your question is, everybody should go watch this 1990s movie, art house film called Deterrence, featuring the actor Robert Pollock, right? And again, has nothing to do with the Middle East, but it does have to do with nuclear deterrence. And it's about a movie about a president, played by Robert Pollock, who is caught in the middle of a global crisis, has to decide whether to retaliate. I think it was against the Russians in nuclear terms. And again, right, not a great lesson, but sometimes not a great movie, but sometimes even not great movies have good lessons. And the lesson here is that time is not on the side of the party that is making the strategic decision. This is frankly why I was concerned about the Israelis waiting so long to retaliate because they waited almost a month to retaliate to the Iranian ballistic missile salvo of October 1st. Iran is now in that position, because the longer Iran waits, the harder, the more complicated the Iranian decision tree becomes, because the Iranians are very fearful of having an attack that is super flimsy, right, or is perceived to be super flimsy. I would note that the October 1st attack of 181 ballistic missiles killed one person, and he was a resident of Gaza. And so there is something to be said for, the strategic deterrent potential of being ambiguous. If the Iranians do something big again and they're unsuccessful, or Israeli defenses are successful, or coalition defenses are successful, that is a huge blow to Iranian credibility. And if Iran's proxies, like Shiite militias in Iraq, move decisively against Israel, and let's be clear, they're already moving in tactical terms against Israel. They're already firing drones over Jordanian airspace into Israeli territory. They're already doing small-scale technological incursions that the Israelis are very concerned about. But if they do something bigger and they face a significant retaliation, and it appears that Iran does not have their back, that's the whole credibility of the Iranian threat network that's at risk. So I think, like Robert Pollock in the movie, the Iranians are facing down hard choices, and the choices get harder and the decision tree becomes more complex the further we go into time. And that doesn't mean that the Iranians aren't going to do something, but it does mean that the longer they wait, the more complicated that decision becomes.
So just to keep these metaphors going, what you're also saying is that those who play with scared money make really bad bets. And let's not forget that Russia made a bad bet on expecting President-elect Trump to lose the election, according to reports that the assassination the assassin they paid to,
Not
to
Russia,
assassinate
Iran.
President
Iran.
Trump.
Yeah.
Did I say Russia? I'm sorry,
Yeah,
Iran.
you're,
Yes,
you're
Iran
jumping
made a
ahead.
bad bet.
You're jumping ahead.
Yes, because I'm just so excited to get to Russia. But yes, they made a bad bet on trying to assassinate soon-to-be President Trump, and we'll get to perhaps what that could mean later on. So you wrote in a Newsweek article, and you referenced it just a moment ago, the three aspects of Iranian strategic planning going forward. So you assess that the consequences of Israel's stunning attacks against Hezbollah and Iran were nothing short of, quote, ruinous. So Iran can be counted on to try and restore its strategic position. It's liable to do so in three ways, and we're going to take each one separately. So the first one is, you said military expansion, conventional military expansion. And my question there is, it seems odd that this country would try to expand their conventional weaponry, because who are they expecting to fight using conventional weaponry?
Well, right. So conventional weaponry in this context means both offensive and defensive weapons. And here you're dealing with two things. First of all, the air defense architecture that Israel eliminated. By the way, right, to foreshadow the conversation we're going to have about Russia, these were all Russian-provided air defenses, right? The Russians have actually made very good business out of exploiting Middle Eastern instability, and they've sold the S-300, which is their supposedly top-of-the-line air defense system, to countries like Iran, also to other countries. And the Israelis simply dominated that, technologically dominated that. So in business terms, Vladimir Putin has a little bit of a hangover, because now he has to answer hard questions about the efficacy of his own hardware too, right? That's the ancillary outcome. But in the context of the way Iran thinks about military maneuvers, the last conflict, force-on-force conflict that Iran fought in the region was the 8-year war with neighboring Iraq. And the Iraqis won handily. The Iraqis, in military terms, ate the lunch of the Iranians. And I think it's a technical term, right? Ever since, the Iranians have really placed significant, almost overwhelming emphasis on asymmetric technology. This is where Iran's building of the proxy network comes from. This is where Iran's emphasis on drones and ballistic missiles come from. And this is where Iran's emphasis on strategic programs like the nuclear program comes from. It's all plausible deniability. It's all indirect conflict. It's all hybrid warfare. The idea being that the military, in conventional terms, isn't all that strong. And by the way, it's made weaker by the fact that, you know, Iran's been under sanctions for literally decades. And so it's harder for Iran to get parts for their planes to continue flying, parts for tank armor, you know, things like that. What you're seeing now is a little bit of a shift. The Iranian regime has already reported, it's available in the open source, that the next Iranian calendar year's budget, and here, Iranian calendar year's budget makes a difference, because it's not like our calendar year, which is December to December, or December 31st to January 1st, nor is it the fiscal calendar, which is September to September. It's actually mid-March to mid-March. That's when the Persian New Year is. So they build everything based upon that timeline. They've already announced that they're going to increase their conventional military budget by 300% in the coming national budget. That is going to go towards procuring defenses, right, to reconstitute that top cover that Israel has managed to pop off. But it's also going to strengthen conventional capabilities, because they understand that, you know, there may be things that are called for. There may be a strengthening of the Air Force that's called for if Israeli planes or American planes are in the vicinity. They need to, the lopsidedness of their strategy up until now has become really evident, I think. So I think that's where you're going to see the emphasis. But it almost doesn't matter where they place the money. The fact that they've made the decision that they're in such a constrained environment, right? And let's remember, the Iranian economy is not doing well. And nonetheless, they've trebled their defense budget, tells you everything you need to know about how they perceive the threats to their regime, and also the threats of their regime survival.
Let's talk about the money, because I think that's really, obviously it's pivotal here. The more money you have, the more you can spend, the less you can spend. In 2020, their GDP at the height of sanctions was 200 billion. Today it's 400 billion. So we're talking somewhere between, which is still a high number, 7.5% of GDP spent on defense to 15% of GDP. 7.5%, I think, is close to double what the highest country in Europe is right now. Not exactly, but pretty close. I think Poland is a little over 4%. So 7.5 to 15 is a staggering amount of money. What do you expect to see in the waning days of the Biden administration? And what do you hope to see or expect to see from the incoming Trump administration? And again, let's remember, they didn't exactly take steps necessary to get on Trump's good side here. He's right. Coming in knowing that they tried to assassinate him. So what are we expecting to see? And this money obviously trickles down to all three of the components that we're going to discuss.
No, I think that's exactly right. The laxness of the Biden administration's focus on the economy or the Iranian economy, Iranian oil sales, things like that, has really been a boon to the Iranian regime. And, right, all fairness, when Biden administration officials go before Congress and they say, hey, listen, we haven't lifted sanctions, we don't know what you're talking about. Technically, that's true. They haven't lifted sanctions. But what they also haven't done is they haven't enforced sanctions. Right? So non-enforcement is the same thing as lifting sanctions, because the companies that you're trying to deter from certain behavior understand there's no consequence to them transshipping Iranian oil, procuring Iranian components, whatever. And countries like India, countries like China, sort of same ball of wax. So the Iranians have benefited tremendously from this sort of deference that's been shown to Iran's sweep in the region, and it's rebounded to the benefit of the Iranian economy. Now, we're like, as I tried to lay out, we are at a stage where Iranian credibility has now been dented by what we've seen happen in the region. So in Iran, that is more flush financially than it was in previous years, can be counted on to act, I think, very predictably. The Iranian regime has historically, very consistently, preferred guns over butter. So it's all about military investments. It's all about investments in strategic programs. It's all about investments in proxies that can carry their agenda forward. So I think, especially at a time when the Iranians have an uphill battle to rebuild their credibility, you're going to see a lot of money flowing to Iranian proxies. You're going to see a lot of defense spending, and I think you're going to see a lot more focus on the fast mover, the most important thing, which is the Iranian nuclear program.
All right, let's get to, that'll be number 3. Number 2, let's talk about domestic repression.
Sure.
American failure to support the Iranian protests is a bipartisan failure. It happened under President Obama in 2009. It happened under President Trump in 2019. They were fundamentally different. If I remember correctly, 2009 was primarily Tehran, but the 2019, very, very widespread throughout the country. 1,500 people were killed by the IRGC, and we've let them down. So with that in mind, can you discuss the various groups involved in opposition forces in Iran? And do you get the sense that Trump will be inclined to support the opposition? And what does that look like?
Well, it's interesting because Iran policy is one of the few places where we know comparatively more about what the Trump second term is going to look like, because Brian Hook, the former special envoy for Iran, is heading up the transition at the State Department. Hook has spoken publicly about the fact that the Trump administration is going to make it a priority to revive maximum pressure to really ratchet up sanctions. But he's also said that the Trump administration is not going to be invested in regime change, meaning the Trump administration is not going to itself initiate regime change. But that does leave open the door of possibility for, if there is some sort of grassroots change that's happening within Iran, that the U.S. would support. I hope they do, because empirically speaking, and again, right, full faith and credit, Americans are very bad at regime change at politically assisted political transitions, like it's not a practice that we're very good at. Nonetheless, objectively, if you look at Iran, every single metric that you look at demonstrates to you that the country is fast approaching some sort of pretty significant political transition. Right? You can sort of see this in economic terms, where per capita, according to the World Bank, the average Iranian is 1/3 poorer than his counterpart in 1979 when the revolution happened, right? So there's been this massive economic failure to thrive. You see this in religious terms. Iran has 2,500 mosques scattered all over the country. 75% of them, according to the Iranian regime, are either now closed completely or have reduced hours because they don't have enough people going to them, right? So there's a massive walking away from religiosity that dents the credibility of the regime. And you see this in social terms, because you talked about the 2009 protests and the 2019 protests, but let's be clear, these are cycles of protests that recur again and again, and they're recurring with increasing frequency. And the one that we're at the tail end of now is, I would argue, the most consequential one. It's the one that was sparked by the death in custody at the hands of Iran's religious police of a young 22-year-old Kurdish Iranian activist named Mahsa Amini. This is what sparked the protests, which are now known as the Woman Life Freedom protests. And initially, Iranians came out on the street to protest religious fiat, religious edicts, repressive dress codes for women. But over time, over the weeks and the months that followed, you saw something really fundamental happen. This is more from discontent with the regime's rule to a rejection of the regime itself. And that's why you have polls, fairly credible polls, done by organizations outside of Iran that are gauging that something like 75, 80% of Iranians now want an end to the Islamic Republic as a whole, right? That is a pretty heady political cocktail, and that's maybe something that ends up being fatal to the Islamic Republic. What we don't have yet is a clear sense of how much the United States is willing to invest in that, or at least keep the door open, implement policies to keep the door open to allow the Iranians to take matters into their own hands. I think you're absolutely right? This was a bipartisan failure in the past. We didn't really spend a lot of time. That was a boon and a benefit to the Iranian regime. They were the only ones that were sort of always at the table when America wanted to talk. But I think conditions are changing, and the long game for the future of Iran is precisely why the United States needs to get more serious about the human terrain within Iran. And I would also say that this is why I think that the Iranian regime is going to redouble its repression domestically, because it sees all of these statistics that I just laid out. It sees it experientially. It sees the discontent on the street. And I think it's very worried now that the regime, as our buddy Rich Goldberg says, as the regime has been revealed that, the Ayatollah has no clothes. Now that we know the Ayatollah has no clothes, they're really worried about the opposition gaining inspiration, gaining traction, having the wind at their back as a result. So I think you're liable to see this wave of deepening repression within the country, whether that's crackdowns on protests, probably, whether it's arrests, imprisonments, torture, killing, disappearances, shutdown of the internet. I think we're in for all of it.
So I'm going to ask a follow-up, but before I do, I want to remind everybody on the call, if you do have a question, please submit it through the ELNET question chat, and we will make sure to ask that question a little bit later on. All right, so my follow-up is this. Regime change are probably the two most cursed words right now in American foreign policy. And it's got an interesting, how do I phrase this? If we don't engage in regime change, it allows for further repression of all opposition forces, and for Iran, the Iranian regime, to strengthen its hold on its people. At the same time, if we do proceed with some sort of action without understanding how difficult regime change is, and mind you, we, America and Europe, have not had such great success in understanding how difficult regime change is. We didn't do it very well in Afghanistan. We did not do it very well in Iraq. We did not do it at all in Libya. all for fear of regime change. We made the same mistake differently in different scenarios. Help us understand something, because I found this fascinating when I was doing a little research. There are dozens of ethnicities in Iran. There are dozens of languages, dozens of religions. If regime change takes hold internally, they have to protect their borders to keep outside agents from coming in, something we didn't do in Afghanistan or Iraq. They need a military. What happens with the IRGC? How does the opposition forces cobble together a unified force to maintain the integrity of the country? Regime change isn't easy. So how does this all play out?
Well, right. And there's a lot there. So let me see if I can unpack it a little bit. You're absolutely right. And the way I would start is my buddy Cliff May from FDD always has this phrase. He says, in order to sell somebody aspirin, you first have to convince them that they have a headache. And we are well and truly in the headache stage of Iran, right? We understand that the Iranian regime is a pernicious actor. It's a explicitly revisionist state. We're worried about the nuclear program. What we don't know yet is what that aspirin is. And here we've been horribly ill-served by our lack of curiosity, I would say, because we are, the Islamic Republic is 45 years old. There have been Iranian opposition groups for as long as there's been an Islamic Republic. And we don't really actually know very much about them still to this day. One of the projects I've been working on over the last year, we just had a report come out, right? Here's the shameless plug. If any of you on the call are interested or watching this afterwards, are interested in reading about this, I have a new special report out on the American Foreign Policy Council website, www.afpc.org. It's called Navigating the Iranian Opposition. And it was my attempt, hopefully somewhat coherent, to address exactly this problem, which is to highlight not what the different groups are, but rather to invert the equation and say, okay, American national security practitioners, whether Democrats or Republicans, as Iran approaches this potentially monumental political transformation, the next regime, what would you like it to look like? How do you make it? How do you articulate what would make it most consonant with American national security interests, right? And that's everything from territorial integrity to the type of government that's going to take over after the Ayatollahs, to how they're going to secure their nuclear archipelago, which is very vast and very distributed. But all of those are very necessary questions, right? Without having that sort of blueprint, without figuring out, hey, we want Iran to stay together because we don't want a loose nuke scenario, or we don't necessarily need democracy in Iran, but we need Iran to at least be pluralistic because of all those languages, all those ethnicities, all those different groups that have been cobbled together over a millennia of Iranian imperialism, right? Without a little bit of deeper thinking about all this stuff, we're completely unmoored. We don't know which opposition groups to support, what they stand for, and where that will leave us. And I think that's a mistake. So my hope is that we sort of start getting smart very quickly.
All right, let's turn to number 3, which is nuclear capabilities, nuclear progress, Iran's nuclear progress. I brought this up a week ago with Michael Pregent, who's a colleague of Mike Duran's at the Hudson. And the way I phrased it was, Iran had 3 strategic elements. One was its proxies, which have pretty much been decimated. They're still there, as we said, but decimated. 2 was its missile and defense capabilities, shown to be ineffectual at best. 3 is their nuclear capabilities. Now, if 2 are lost and you have 1 to rely on, it would seem to make sense that they're going to move there as quickly as possible. What do you think? What are they looking at? What
I think that's exactly right. So here it's necessary to point out that the Iranian strategy towards their nuclear program that they've pursued up until now no longer obtains, right? Because the strategy was essentially incremental. They were salami slicing their way to a nuclear capability. They would take very small incremental steps that were reversible under the assumption that European governments and the United States would not make an issue out of it, right? Would really sort of not not respond in a really forceful, effective way, you know, with sanctions or diplomatic censure, whatever it is, if they incrementally add centrifuges, expand processes, enrich to a slightly higher level. But all of that hinges upon two things. First of all, it hinges upon time. The idea that the Iranians, even as they negotiate with the West, they're buying time for the maturity of their nuclear program, right? And it hinges upon their ability to protect their own nuclear program, their ability to have top cover so that nobody can eliminate it, right? Those two things are now gone, right? Because Israel has managed to, as I sort of said in another interview, to pop the lid off of the Iranian nuclear program, in the sense that there's now no air defense cover that would provide it with protection. And there is a sense, and I think it's correct, that either Israel or the United States, or some combination of both, are really going to take an issue with the Iranian nuclear program. The hour is getting late. The nuclear program is increasingly mature. The Iranians are nervous and they're vulnerable. And so the speed of their effort has to change. It is no longer acceptable for them just to inch out of the confines of international regulation. They're going to sprint for the bomb, right? It's not just me saying this. There's more and more analysts in the United States and in Israel that are convinced that we're about to see an Iranian sprint for the bomb, because the Iranians understand very well that there is defense, there is protection in being a nuclear possessor. And right, this has been sort of shown in the context of Russia, in the context of China. The Iranians feel like they're in a very vulnerable place now. It's all about eliminating that vulnerability. So I think moving fast, as Mark Zuckerberg says, right, moving fast and breaking things is going to become the new Iranian strategy. And you're already beginning to see this, because last weekend, 8 days ago, 9 days ago, there were a number of Iranian officials that gave public interviews talking about the need to revise and modernize Iran's nuclear doctrine, which is a really weird thing to say if you don't have a nuclear weapon, because theoretically you wouldn't have a nuclear doctrine. And yet they're talking about it. They're talking about the need to rethink their approach to nuclear weapons. That's a signal that things are changing in a very fundamental sense.
How long is this sprint?
I mean, that is really the $1 million question, I think. It's unclear. It's also clouded by the fact that the Iranian nuclear thing is not a monolithic, isolated thing. They've got lots of injects, right? So most of your viewers may not know that the Iranian civilian nuclear energy generation program, at least a big part of it, has been a turnkey Russian affair since the late 1990s, right? The Russians built and then have since administered the Bushehr reactor in the south of Iran. In much of the same way, a lot of the critical components and injects, as the military folks say, into Iran's development of both the nuclear program and also an offensive nuclear capability isn't just Iranian. It's also, for example, North Korean. There are credible reports that every time North Korea carries out a nuclear test, and there's been, a dozen of them over the last decade, there is a delegation of Iranian engineers that is present and is watching, right? It is foolish to believe that there is no interplay between Pyongyang and Tehran on nuclear processes, nuclear know-how, especially since the broader frame that we're all operating under is that you're seeing Russia, China, and Iran drawing closer and closer together in terms of everything from military coordination to disinformation to everything else. And countries like North Korea are orbiting this emerging axis, and they're eager to help, right? They're helping provide Vladimir Putin with cannon fodder in the context of Ukraine, for example. So the idea that the Iranian nuclear program is just the Iranian nuclear program, I think, frankly, is a little bit silly. It's also a little bit ahistoric.
For the next 2.5 months are going to be really quite interesting to watch. Do they make a press for it during this interregnum? Knowing that Biden, we'll see what Biden does. Does Biden work with Israel? What does Israel do during this period of time? Do they feel like they may have a loose rein to do something? It'll be quite interesting to see what happens over the next 2.5 months. Since you mentioned Russia, let's delve into Russia. I think by now most people know Putin has brought in roughly 7 to 10,000. I'm not sure the actual number of North Koreans to fight in Ukraine. And it says something about Russia, but I'm not entirely sure what it says about Russia, that he is going externally to bring in North Koreans. What are your thoughts on
I mean, I can tell you exactly what it says. What you have, and we are, I think we're misinformed by how we're reading Russia, because we tend to focus externally on the fast mover in the conversation, which is the Russia-Ukraine war. We spend far less time looking at internal social dynamics, internal political dynamics. Vladimir Putin still preserves a fairly high popularity rating, somewhere between 65 and 70%. I think frankly, that's a function of demographics. That's a function of the fact that that support has actually solidified, because a lot of the people that were conscientious objectors to the war have now left already. So and also, by the way, in authoritarian regimes, polling tends to be skewed. So I think all of those things work in his favor. But what doesn't work in his favor is when the war becomes proximate, when the war becomes local. So if you notice, one of the most unpopular things that Vladimir Putin has done since February of 22, since the start of what he calls the special military operation against Ukraine, was in the September of 2023, when he announced a partial mobilization of the Russian people in order to beef up the ranks on the front. That order, even though it was carried out incrementally, even though it stretched out over weeks, sparked the single largest exodus of Russians from the country since the 1917 revolution. So that's a huge tell for me. The idea that Vladimir Putin is presiding over this conflict, a lot of Russians are okay with it because, frankly, sanctions aren't biting as hard. And the war is distant because that partial mobilization drew folks from, drew conscripts and fighting age males from places like Crimea, places that are far away from urban centers like Moscow and St. Petersburg. What he is trying to defer a decision about a national mobilization as long as possible. And this is getting harder and harder to do. The British Ministry of Defense a month ago estimated, right, according to their own estimates, that the Russians have now experienced over 600,000 casualties in Ukraine. That is more casualties than the country has experienced cumulatively in every single conflict since the Second World War, right? That's a big deal. And it's a big deal that's made even bigger by the fact that Russia has really deeply adverse demographic trends. And so Vladimir Putin, he is inching towards a decision to do a national mobilization, right? And I think we're going to see that in the next several months. But before he does, he's going to exhaust every measure that he can to try to prevent that, or try to hold, push that off as long as possible. And that includes importing cannon fodder from compliant allies, including the North Koreans.
I could talk to you and ask you questions all day long, you know that, but we have a number of people who want to ask questions. So I'm going to segue to a very brief ELNET commercial, and then we'll open it up for some questions. For all of you on the call, one, thank you for joining us. Many of you are supporters of the organization. Thank you for that as well. You know our work is to align the interests between Europe and Israel and align those interests with the United States. We call that the triad for the 21st century. It is a global challenge we are facing, and we share the same adversaries as we're discussing today: Russia, Iran, North Korea, and China. They make very little distinction between those of us in the West. If we are in the West, we are counter to them. Every member of parliament, every journalist, every member of think tank that we can take to Israel, that we can take from Israel to Europe, bridges these gaps and helps these countries align their interests in broader and deeper ways, diplomatically, in ways of defense, intelligence, strategy, and economics. So if you're able to invest in our work, and I think the ROI on that investment is significant, I encourage you to support us for 2024. If you're in the position to increase that investment, please do so. And if you've not yet joined our Diplomacy Club, please do that as well. Your investment in this organization matters. It matters to Europe. it matters to Israel, and it matters to the United States. So thank you. Thank you again for joining us. Okay, so Saul Brenner. Saul Brenner has a question. I'd like to open the floor to Saul. Saul, you're on mute.
In today's Wall Street Journal, there were two authors, I'm not familiar with them, Garish and Takaya, who argued that Iran may dash for the bomb now, which seems to be what you seem to be thinking will be happening. Obviously, I think you believe that to be the case. But also, is the United States the only country that is capable of destroying Iran's nuclear capability because of its location deep inside a mountain in Iran?
Wow. So thank you, Saul, for the easy question. This is no. So really, this is, I think, probably the most important, the most consequential question. And I would point out that in the context of figuring out what to do with Iran's nuclear program, there's really only two countries that matter. There's the United States, which has the capabilities, and there's Israel, which increasingly has the political will. Now, Iran is in a much better place still than it was in the months leading up to October 7th of last year, because back then there was, and I spent a lot of time in Israel, and so, I talked to all these guys fairly regularly. There was a consensus among Israeli officials and former officials that I talked to that the clock was ticking, the hour was getting late. And even those that supported the JCPOA, the 2015 nuclear deal, had come to the conclusion that, America's not going to carry this water, that Israel is going to have to do it itself. Israel's got its hands full, right? Advisedly now. So for a while, the Iranians were sitting prettier. I think that's not the case anymore. And I think it's not the case anymore because everybody understands. First of all, you're going to have an administration here in Washington soon that I think sees the nuclear program very much the same way the Israeli government does, the current Israeli government does. And also because I think the Israelis don't think about eliminating the Iranian nuclear program, right? So you've heard the phrase "mow the grass," right? You've heard it umpteen times. And what do they mean by this? So I had a conversation with an old dear friend of mine who happened to be one of the pilots who flew the Israeli raid to denuclearize Iraq in the early 1980s. And he told me this fascinating story. He said, we were young, we were foolish, we were concerned about what would happen. The assumption was we were going to get shot down, we're going to get captured, killed, tortured, whatever it is. So we asked lots of hard questions to our leaders, to our military leadership about this. And the answer that came back was the military leadership at that time assessed that a military strike on the Osirak nuclear reactor would set back the Iraqi nuclear program by half a decade at least. And the Israeli National Command Authority thought that's enough. And he told me this story by way of saying, we think about the Iranian nuclear program today a little bit differently. You Americans tend to think about it, can you get at all the sites? Can you sort of, hollow out these mountains? Can you do whatever it is? We don't think of it that way. We think of it in the context of, can we mow the grass? And here I would point out that it may be difficult to conceive of Israel, not the United States, or Israel acting alone or without American support or whatever it is, really reaching in root and branch and pulling out the Iranian nuclear program. I think it's far more achievable and it's far more realistic to think about mowing the grass, to think about military actions aimed at the nuclear program that would set it back. And here, this is where I sort of come back to the people. So there's a famous Israeli professor named David Menashri. He is the dean of Israeli-Iran studies. And Menashri, like 20, 25 years ago, wrote an article and he sort of laid it out this way. He said, look, there are two trains that are leaving the station. One is the political transformation train, and the other is the nuclear program, right? In the context of Iran, obviously. And he says, if the second train moves faster and gets to the end point before the first train does, the first train will never get to the station. So I think in the Israeli conception, the goal is not eliminating it outright. The goal is changing up that order so that the first train runs faster than the second train. And that leaves a huge conversation that neither we nor the Israelis are having right now, which is, okay, that's great. You've bought yourself some time. You've mowed the grass. What do you do with that time, right? That's a conversation we're not having yet, but we need to.
I see.
Thank you, Saul. And keep those metaphors coming, Ilan. You are a master of the metaphor. I mean, what a great way to explain things. Zoreh Mizrahi, I'd like to welcome you to the floor. Hi, Zoreh.
Thank you, Mark, and thank you, Ilan, for this wonderful presentation. I often read your articles, and I appreciate the updates you provide to us. The question that I have, which I think you touched upon a little bit, but it's the history of U.S. administrations, one after another, failing the policy on Iran. They often talk about having a more hawkish way of dealing with the regime, but they end up going to bed with the mullahs and sort of appeasing them. And this has brought about a sense of mistrust within the Iranian masses to the point that when Netanyahu goes and delivers an announcement to the Iranian people that their freedom is closer than ever, they don't know what to do about it. So the question is, how could the US government compensate for this consistent failure over the past 40-some years?
Wow. Okay, so that's a hard question too. So let me see if I can answer. First of all, and Zoreh, you know this very well, but others on the call may not. The Iranian opposition is not one thing. It's many things, but it's effectively divided into two groups, two wings, right? There's the opposition inside the country. These are the people that you see protesting, the people that you see holding up signs on television, and the much more organized different groups that exist in the diaspora, right? Where they have the political freedom to organize, they have the political freedom to move around. And a lot of them have built constituencies, have built a very fertile ecosystem for themselves. Just the way I look at it, fundamentally, first of all, because as Mark said, we're not very good at this, America generally, but also because we don't understand the complexities that exist in these two wings and we don't understand them properly. We have to be very judicious. We have to be very sort of conservative about how we think about the Iranian opposition. Right? Because this is a battle that ultimately is going to be decided by the Iranians themselves. And I would argue actually the Iranians that are inside the country that have skin in the game much more than the Iranians outside. But there are still things that we can do to make it easier for them. And that's where I think the proper role of the United States is. There are institutions, policy institutions, think tanks, foundations, places like FTD, places like NUFTI, the National Union for Democracy in Iran, that have been spending a lot of time working on this stuff. And they've actually put out a policy plan. And again, right, we can sort of talk about the different components, but the idea is to provide maximum support, right? Not just maximum pressure on the regime, but maximum support for the opposition. And that could be everything from connectivity technology, right? Providing things like Starlink to opposition elements to allow them to connect despite the fact that the regime closes off their communications, all the way to doing what the US did during the Cold War and in Eastern Europe, and creating a strike fund, for example, right? And this is a very simple concept, but it's actually a very powerful concept. If you're an Iranian factory worker in Tehran or in Isfahan or wherever it is, and you are so discontented that you go out in the street, you're very likely going to lose your job at the very least. So the question really becomes, as you make a decision to protest, make a decision to become politically active, how are you going to feed your family? And if the regime holds all the cards in that conversation, the regime can turn off the spigot just by being more brutal, by being more vindictive. And pluralizing that conversation becomes important. It's not the full answer, but it's the start of an answer to all of these measures that we can do. But I agree with you completely. We've spent very, very little time figuring out exactly what those measures are. We've spent a lot of time looking for cookie cutter solutions, which is why we end up in a place where we don't really understand the opposition very well. And we haven't really spent a lot of time looking at the levers that we can pull with our political and economic weight that could really make a difference for them on the street.
Thank you.
So given the time, we're going to take one more question. I'm sorry, everybody. We just can't take everybody's question. But what I will do is suggest you ask your regional director, Sari, Sia, or me. Always happy to entertain any questions you may have. And if we can get you the answers ourselves, we most certainly will do so. So again, if you're not able to ask a question and you had one, by all means, reach out to us, please, and we're happy to help. The next question goes to Tom Flesch, ELNET chair.
You have to unmute me.
You're
on mute. We can hear you.
hit it again. Hit it again.
This is a very, very, very good presentation with a lot of in-depth. There's so many moving parts that are involved right now, and it seems it gets more complicated as days go by. With the regime change issue, it seems to me, from what I've been reading, the younger generation is getting more and more impatient for a regime change. And that the current regime, even if they double down and start enforcing even more, may exacerbate some kind of internal regime change. And that, I think, is worthy. I think it's very clear that what the Iranians have is the nuclear threat. I think it's not that much different than Russia right now. Russia's conventional warfare is showing that it has a lot of vulnerability, and their soldiers very vulnerable, and they're importing soldiers, I suppose, right now to keep some distance from unrest within their own country. And having said that, their fallback, but their strength is their nuclear option. That's what they have, and that's really the most threatening. And so having said that, it seems to me that China is the real issue right now, because they have, well, we don't know how strong they really are, but we fear they have all the weapons, they have all the people, they have all the things to deter bad actions and be supportive of their allies. So I just don't know how this pans out. It just seems that there will be a regime change in Iran. I don't know when, and that and I do feel, I have two comments today. I feel, first of all, the United States of America has the strongest force on the face of the earth, and it's the people's will and our government and how they're going to use it to deter the bad acts. And secondly, I feel from my heart, it's this tiny country, Israel, that is supporting and is in the forefront with their soldiers fighting for freedom and democracy in the free world. And we have to do everything we possibly can to support their efforts. They're fighting, they're doing it, they're doing the heavy lifting. And what we can do is support our delegations, support the work that ELNET is doing throughout this world, so that Israel has the support. And we need support from countries. These are major supports that's necessary. And I just, God willing, we can continue to do what we have and have some kind of peace in this world. And it's Israel, the tiny little country, Israel. During the Nixon regime, they made certain kinds of references of what that little country was. But how could they have such a presence? And they do. And so we need to support them. And we hope we can get your support, all your viewers. If you can flash Randy across the screen again, the giving instructions. Just please support. The end of the year is coming up. Make ELNET, please make ELNET part of your end of year giving plans. It's tax deductible, and we need it more than ever. Thank you. I don't know if you have a comment on that, but
No. The only thing I would say is I think you're absolutely right. So first of all, right, the reason I'm here is because I believe in this completely, and ELNET's doing a great job, and I've spent time with ELNET in Europe, and really tremendous work. Your point about the nuclear program and regime change is actually I think, hugely important because it's not separate. They're not separate things. They're all one thing. And the way I would explain it is this: Iran is a country of 87.5 million people. 2/3 of the Iranian population are under the age of 36. The Iranian regime, the current Iranian regime, is 45 years old. And it means that the plurality of the Iranian population, the plurality of that 87.5 million people, were either not even born or were not old enough to be politically aware when the Ayatollah Khomeini stepped off the plane in Tehran in February of 1979. That matters a great deal. It means that the ideological bonds that tether the population to the regime are actually very flimsy. And so the regime understands that time is not on its side. The regime, by contrast, is very old, right? You have clerical leadership that's in its 80s and 90s, and they're trying to lock their regime into place. And the way they figured out how to do that is by acquiring a capability that will essentially coup-proof them, right? That will prevent the international community from reaching into Iran and really helping empower the people. That's the nuclear program. So I think it's a mistake to think about those two things separately. They're intimately connected. And the longer we can buy time until Iran has a nuclear program, the better. But we also have to have a strategic purpose and think about the Iranian street once we do.
So I want to again thank you, and Mark, an excellent thank you. You did an excellent job on this interview, and again, can't overemphasize the need for every one of our viewers and their friends to come out and support the work that we're doing. And it was Henry Kissinger that had the conversation with Nixon and how they referred to that tiny little country, blank country in the Middle East. How can they have this kind of a presence? But God bless Israel and all of us for supporting. Thank you.
Well, that's the mic drop, folks. I've got nothing to add on that one. Ilan, always a pleasure, always informative. Everybody, enjoy your day. All the best.
Thank you.